Welcome, everybody. Seeing everyone's audio connecting. So welcome. My name is Jen Rowe. I'm from the city of Boston. I'm as chair of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization's TIP Process Engagement and Readiness Committee. I'll now call this meeting to order and read some of our introductory notices and guidelines. So you're invited to participate in our transportation planning process, regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status, or background. Please. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, Level AA standards, and revised Section 508 standards. If you require additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, or if you have any technical difficulties, please contact Adriana Jacobson of MPO staff at ajacobsen@ctps.org or 857-702-36663 or via the chat box. So some of our guidelines, all participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. We ask that you rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. After the roll call, board members may mute and unmute themselves, but please always do remain muted unless you're actively speaking. And then to participate in the discussion, you can use the raise hand function, which you can find either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with the raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar. As chair, I'll then call on participants. And then finally, if you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. All right, so for anyone who just joined, my name is Jen Rowe. I'm from the city of Boston. I chair this committee, and I'll now call upon other members of the committee, beginning with MassDOT Transportation Seat 1.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Chris Clem representing MassDOT Transportation Seat 1.
Thanks, Chris. Next, MassDOT Seat 2.
I gotta take second fiddle to Chris. All right, I'll be MassDOT C2, John Bouchard, representing Highway Administrator Jonathan Gulliver.
Yep.
Just kidding, Chris.
MAPC.
Good afternoon, Eric Brasso with MAPC.
Thanks, Eric. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Diggins, Advisory Council here.
Thanks, Len. Town of Brookline. Aaron on. We can loop back.
I'm not seeing her, no.
Okay. Town of Arlington. I think we may have heard John might be late.
Nope, John Melissa's here.
Yeah, all right.
Town of Arlington.
Welcome, John. Intercore Committee, City of Somerville.
Good afternoon, Chair. Brad Rawson, representing City of Somerville, Intercore, Mayor Ballantyne. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Brad. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Dennis Giambetti, representing Metro West. Good afternoon.
Good, Dennis. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton. Kristen on.
I'm not seeing Kristen.
Okay, thanks, Ethan. Metro West Regional Transit Authority.
Good afternoon. This is Tyler Tarasi representing Administrator Jim Nee for the MWRTA present.
Welcome, Tyler. And has anyone else logged on since I've began roll?
Tom Bent, City of Somerville. Thanks.
All right. Well, we will proceed now. I did want to leave plenty of time for discussion, so I won't have any other members of the public introduce themselves verbally, but please do feel free to put your name and affiliation in the chat if you'd like. We today have a set of meeting minutes to approve, and then we'll devote the majority of the meeting to revised programming scenarios for the TIP Regional Target Program, all three of which build on the scenario 1A. We'll have the opportunity to indicate our preference among those scenarios to the MPO board. Before I turn it over to Ethan, we have an opportunity for members of the public to comment. We traditionally offer this at the outset of the meetings, but we also do, if their time allows, allow non-members to contribute to discussion. So no pressure to comment now if you're able to stay on. So would anyone from the public here who would like to speak? And I see two hands already. I'll call first on Len Simon.
Thank you, and nice to see you all again. My name is Len Simon, formerly a member of the Sudbury Board of Selectmen. I've been in front of you a number of times advocating for the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail. My question today is fairly straightforward and simple. To what extent, if any, do you anticipate that the new administration in Washington will change anticipated funds available for particularly rail trail projects, including the extension phase 3 of the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail in Sudbury and Framingham, which is now scheduled for the, I believe, 2029 TIP. Thank you.
I can kind of answer that question. Granted, this is just mostly for public comment, but just to clarify to the point of the question here, projects that are programmed on the TIP use federal formula dollars, not federal discretionary dollars. So for now, we are currently proceeding as we have been for the past few years under the bipartisan infrastructure law. Projects that are programmed on the TIP with federal formula dollars will continue to be programmed on the TIP so long as fiscal constraint allows within the program, which is also the subject of today's discussion, though there is currently no planned change for the specific Bruce Freeman Phase 3 project that was mentioned today. So that project specifically is secure.
Thank you very much.
Ethan. Next, John.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is John Tebow. I'm the Chief of Staff for Mayor Nicholson here in the city of Lynn. Thank you to the board for having me and this opportunity to speak. I have just a quick comment. I'm going to very quickly read through a few bullet points because I tried to prepare, so my thoughts were gathered. I'm here to speak regarding two projects currently programmed in the TIP that are located in Lynn: rehabilitation of Western Ave, project 609246, and rehabilitation of Essex Street, project 609252. Thank you to the MPO board and staff for all the hard work that has gone into developing the current proposed TIP in a very challenging fiscal environment. And I would also like to, as you may know, we would like to thank you for the support and commitment for both of these projects. Both of these projects can reconstruct critical regional transportation corridors to provide greatly improved multimodal transportation, introduce safety improvements for all roadway users, and improve roadway operations. Both corridors suffer from a high number of crashes, each with a high, each designated in the top 200 high crash intersection, and along with multiple pedestrian and bicycle crash clusters. Reconstruction of these roadways are integral to our efforts to improve multimodal transportation access, improve safety, and improve traffic operations. Vision Lynn, the city's comprehensive plan, also identifies these areas and similar improvements along key corridors to drive economic development in the city, which is critical to transformational change that we're seeking. I'm here to reaffirm our commitment to both of these projects, as we have shared in our letter, which I sent off last night, and we're working to design the development schedule expeditiously and in close collaboration with you all. Although we believe that we can meet key design and right-of-way milestones to meet the timeline of the current TIP, the city is supportive of delaying the Essex Street corridor to federal fiscal year 2028. But we respectfully request that the MPO board consider extending the Western Ave project by only 1 year to federal fiscal year 2029. There is strong community support for these projects, and the city has demonstrated an ability to complete the right-of-way process in a timely manner with both the Broadway project and working closely with MassDOT on the Northern Strand. We're committed to delivering these projects on time. Thank you for your time, and I'd like to note that Rich Benevento from Ty & Bond is on hand to answer any questions from a technical perspective that you may have. Thank you again.
Thank you, John. Comment is well received. Next, Bill.
Yes, hi Jen and committee, thanks for having me. I just wanted to come and participate in the meeting and just update the city's comments that we made at the MPO meeting last week on two projects. The first is the Cambridge Street project where we had a federal congressional earmark that was getting complicated to meet the deadline for that this year. So we had spoken about including that in the tip for next federal fiscal year. On further consideration and looking at the complications of the project, we actually don't think it's a good match for tip funding in the next federal fiscal year because of the nature of the kind of quick map. It's a mixture of quick build and construction, and there are just a lot of moving parts to it. So we appreciate the consideration of that. As our first priority, though, we would like to still see about the possibility of getting $2 million in funding for design for our Fitchburg bicycle pedestrian bridge crossing that did apply and was very highly rated in the design pilot. But we had won an RCN grant of $2.4 million. We have signed the agreements with Federal Highway and MassDOT for that, but only $400,000 of the money was actually obligated up to and through the NEPA phase that would be combined with the city's $600,000 match. So we still have $2 million kind of in limbo, and we understand based on most recent information that we've gotten through NACDO and other sources that those competitive grants are all getting reviewed right now, particularly if they have a bicycle or other components that might not match with current federal priorities. So we are kind of in a very difficult position right now where we're still in the designer selection process, yet it's very hard for us to move ahead with the design, not knowing the status of a majority of the funding for the project. So we would greatly appreciate consideration for funding for the next federal fiscal year on that. And I'll stay on in case any questions come up about that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. One quick follow-up is I just wanted to confirm that this is design funding that you're seeking.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, this is all for design funding. Yeah. And we do have agreements all signed. For the grant portion, we still have yet to sign a reimbursement agreement with MassDOT about the funding, which is basically the reimbursement mechanism. So I'm assuming that however that is done, if we were to get some funding for this, that would be wrapped into such an agreement, but I'd let MassDOT, let us know how that would be done.
Great. Thank you, Bill. All right. Would any other members of the public like to speak at this time? All right. Seeing none, we'll continue into the first action item. All right, so that's approval of our February 13th meeting minutes, which were posted earlier. Are there any questions or comments about the meeting minutes before I ask for a motion to approve? All right. Brad.
Chair, I'll make a motion to approve. Thanks.
I'll second the motion.
Thank you, Eric. I have a motion in a second. I'll now call roll. MassDOT, seat 1.
MassDOT seat 1, yes.
All right, MassDOT seat 2.
Seat 2, John Bouchard, yes.
Great. MAPC.
Eric Barassi, yes.
Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Yes.
I believe Town of Brookline might not be here. I'll go jump in if Aaron has joined. Town of Arlington.
John Alessi, yes.
Great. Intercore Committee, City of Somerville.
Brad Rawson, yes.
Great. Metroist Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton, I believe, has joined.
Yes, I apologize for being late.
Thank you. And then Metroist Regional Transit Authority.
Tyler Tarasi, yes.
Great. And Jen Rowe, as chair, I also vote yes. I believe that calls roll. And the motion passes. We can now move on to the next action item. And I'll pass this to Ethan to start.
All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon, folks. Thanks for joining us for another TIP committee meeting. My name's Ethan Lapointe, and the main item for today is the presentation on some of the revised programming scenarios for the federal fiscal year 26 to 30 TIP, revised based on the discussions and decisions made by the MPO board at last Thursday's MPO meeting. So to move on to the next slide and the one after that, please, I'll just start off with a presentation overview. We'll go over just some of the primary objectives for today, cover some of the materials that were posted in advance for this meeting for review, recap some of what was discussed at last week's MPO board meeting, and then of course go into an overview on each of the 3 new scenarios that are proposed for discussion here today. Also note, it will greatly facilitate discussion and decision around a final scenario on the April 3rd MPO board meeting if towards the end of discussion today, members wanted to indicate preference towards one of the 3 scenarios that I'll be getting into later in this meeting. Just raising that now, I will reiterate that throughout this. And then in addition to the scenario overview, I just want to mention other outstanding factors, items that may need to be considered in the future, may come up next week or later, or items that we've received a little bit too late to factor into the materials for today. Then, of course, main focus is on discussion. So on the next slide, today's primary objective is that following the selection of scenario 1A as the scenario from last week from the MPO board meeting, this committee is being presented with options for what we're referring to as scenario 2, 2A, 2B, and 2C. These options are all going to be reiterated and discussed at the April 3rd MPO meeting, and at the end of that meeting, staff are going to require a vote to adopt a final scenario to take place. Any recommendation from this committee should help facilitate that discussion to take place. On the next slide, to help with that today, 3 full scenarios are posted in one file on the MPO meeting calendar, and there are simplified scenarios that are also available as a separate file. The simplified scenarios differ from the full scenarios, and that simplified scenarios consolidate the lower risk or smaller scale line items on the tip to make it so that the scenarios only show either primary movers, being projects with risks, projects that were delayed, new projects, etc., or other higher level big ticket items for reference there. So if you do have limited time, you can always refer to the simplified scenarios, and these will of course also be available at next week's MPO meeting. On the next slide, as always, we also should have I'll also direct members to reference the 26 to 30 project descriptions, which provide summaries for all projects that are currently programmed on the TIP or proposed for inclusion as well. So on the next slide, I'll now get into a recap of the March 20th MPO meeting. And after I introduce this first slide, I'm actually going to pass over to Jen just to kind of discuss a little bit more detail of what was discussed there. But last week on March 20th, the MPO board met in full to discuss the initial programming scenarios for the 2630 TIP. And as I just mentioned, of 4 programming scenarios that were presented, the board opted to advance scenario 1A. As part of that discussion, which led to the adoption of the scenario, there were questions that were raised that could be discussed as part of either today's discussion or in a future MPO meeting. Specifically, this related to a motion that was made on project readiness reviews. I'll just say verbatim. The motion was to direct the TIP Process Engagement Readiness Committee, this committee, to recommend to the full board a set of expectations for the proponents of projects programmed in the TIP Regional Target Program. Now, I said we could discuss this today. This is very likely to continue to be discussed over the coming months, but it's very unlikely that there will actually be a recommendation developed or expectations set in time for the final scenario to be adopted next week, which is to say We're still working to advance this as a key priority, but this is an effort that is going to extend beyond the ability to take effect as part of this TIP development. And so on the next slide, I will actually hand the reins over to Jen for a moment to discuss some other more specific items about this request. So thank you, Jen.
Thank you, Ethan. And yes, as again, we don't have time to fully come to a recommendation around this at this meeting. I did want to take the chair's prerogative to share some initial ideas about how we might be able to approach this motion, followed by a brief opportunity for like any clarifying questions, and then an offer to meet separately with anyone who'd like to discuss this further before we take this up again in our upcoming meeting in May. My hope here is to just keep our collective juices going on this, even as we focus on scenario development. So I guess first, in developing expectations, overall, would propose like a goal of incentivizing good communication, collaboration, and progress towards project delivery, while also mitigating the risk to the overall program of projects. I've found it helpful to think about two different categories of expectations we could establish. One, expectations for information sharing, and then second, expectations around design progress. So the MPO board has already begun developing expectations around information sharing beyond the project's initial application. For example, we've requested that project proponents share some updated schedules in advance of the scenario discussion that we had last week. That is something that this committee could develop into something that's more like an annual requirement. The MPO board also voted to request by end of this year updated cost estimates of project proponents. And again, this is something we could discuss further and establish as something that could be a regularly occurring expectation for projects that are on the tip. There's also MPO staff brought forward some options they may have for rescoring projects and kind of the need to request information from project proponents to do that efficiently. Again, that's something we can talk further about becoming an expectation, whether just for this cycle or ongoing. Especially as it relates to changes in project scope, which we found to be an important driver to cost changes. And there is an existing policy for that changes to project scope require TIP amendments when they're in the first year of the TIP. So this, again, could be, we could work towards developing a clear expectation of communication around those changes to project scope, perhaps on an annual basis, which would help staff keep scores up to date going forward. So those are some kind of avenues that we have. Next slide, please. And I think I kind of mentioned this overall goal that this would allow us to incentivize good communication, collaboration, and progress. It also could define for us projects that are in good standing. So if a project meets these conditions, it could be considered automatically to be incorporated into readiness scenarios and initial TIP scenarios. Whereas if projects that weren't kind of providing this information could be deferred and considered at the same time as previously unprogrammed projects. So the goal here, again, to provide the board with the information we would need to make fair, informed decisions, and also to help us feel justified in not always awarding an existing project priority over new projects, which is something we've been discussing for some time. Next slide, please. The second kind of category of types of expectations we may have might be around the design progress. At last week's MPO meeting, the board discussed the possibility of a design threshold for inclusion or continued inclusion in the regional target program, with the 25% design mentioned as a possible threshold. My sense is that may require some further clarification as to what we mean by that, but that's one example of such a design threshold for the whole program. In addition, we could consider thresholds for programming projects in each year of the TIP, which would then define when how far along a project would need to be in its design to be considered in each year. For example, we could say, a project in the first year, maybe it would need to have a 75% design accepted by MassDOT, just as an example, but something to that extent. Next slide, please. So the kind of what would these design progress expectations do for us? If a project would meet the design threshold for a given TIP year, MPO staff could go ahead and program it in that year in a readiness scenario. If it didn't, staff would not automatically do so. And if a proponent wanted an exception from this, the onus would be on them to explain why. And we could define some parameters around what that would look like, providing an updated schedule, a presentation before the committee or the board. And again, and here a goal being creating some standards to help us minimize risk to the overall program by programming projects in realistic fiscal years and helping us address what we've seen as patterns of delays and cost increases that, when coming late in the cycle, can be disruptive. Next slide, please. So I think my sense is that developing broadly supported sets of expectations are going to take getting into the nuances of project design and development to really avoid throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as the saying goes. So there's a lot to unpack and discuss. I believe we will want to do this primarily after we've selected a scenario, so as not to get tangled up in that conversation when we have to meet some deadlines. I do think I want to take maybe like 5 to 10 minutes now, though, if folks have some initial kind of clarifying questions that they may have about these different options we may have that you think it's important for everyone to hear. And then I also want to make an offer to schedule kind of individual conversations with myself and Ethan and Adriana, so that we can kind of continue these conversations and hear the different perspectives in advance of our upcoming meeting in May, so that conversation can be as productive as possible. So I'll stop there and welcome any kind of clarifying questions. We'll also be sending around these slides too, so you can kind of take some time to take a look and digest. Yeah, Tom.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, just one thing I wanted to kind of clarify on some of this, where we were a few years ago. The MPO had a subcommittee to look at the TIP and all the issues that come up with late entries and where we are as far as the design process. And it was determined back then in the recommendation, which was voted on, was that we wanted to have projects get to 25% design status. And I believe what was meant by that was being an approved 25% design. But it's a good point that that you bring up, that we kind of have to clarify that. But at the time, so that was the recommendation. But later on, during that discussion, we also felt back, I think it was at least 2 years ago, that it wasn't fair to say, hey, this is the new rule now. So we kind of gave it this grace period. And I think with the TIP becoming more and more difficult, And we seem to be getting more and more design changes, cost increases, last minute entries that I think the feeling is that the grace period needs to be done with. It's over. We have to draw the line. And basically, we voted that, I believe at the MPO meeting last week, that it wouldn't be in effect with this particular tip because, again, we don't want to drop the hammer on everybody, now. But going forward to next year, we have to kind of set some standards as to if you have a project, it has to be at 25%. We can't be getting, last minute, major cost increases, or changes while we're in the process of trying to formulate the next tip. So I think I just wanted to give people a little bit of the institutional knowledge of what's going on in the past and what the intent was of the subcommittee a few years ago, that we need to get the tip under control. And basically, with federal funding and everything else being such a, clouded feature now, it's making it more and more difficult to do this. And I think it would be in everybody's best interest if they understand what is required going into next year to get a project on the tip.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that perspective. And absolutely, I think it's part of what we will kind of be the history will bring to the conversation in May. Josh, and then Brad.
Hi, Josh Ostrov with the MBTA, not a member of this committee. So I do appreciate this discussion. I think it's really helpful to educate folks about it. I just point out that transit projects usually have a different, process design thresholds, and if just while they're a majority of projects that the MPO considers, it may be helpful just to understand how they are unique. And time is finite, so I won't go into all that here, but perhaps at a future discussion. And we're happy to work with you if that's helpful. The RTAs may have the perspective too. Thanks.
I appreciate that. Yeah, definitely a lot of nuance, including the differentiation between the many types of projects that we fund here. Brad.
Thanks, Chair. In addition to Tom's points about the work that this MPO, our staff, our agency partners have done in the 3, and 5, and 7-year history, I just want to take this moment also to remind all of us of the important process improvements that we have gone through together as part of this tip cycle. I want to give credit where credit's due, not only to MPO staff, but to Mass DOT staff, who have really worked to acknowledge and honor the direction and request from this board about more timely information sharing, backing up our approved MPO operations plan. John Bouchard, tip of the cap to you and your team. You have illuminated and educated all of us about project development pipelines, milestones, and systems limitations that can sometimes create hiccups for applicants or create hiccups for Mass DOT-led projects. And as we go through this period of austerity, which is scary to all of us, whether we are project proponents or not, I would ask all of us to approach this stuff with grace and a long-term commitment to each other to continue improving these processes for regional equity and for just risk control. We are learning about project management. We are in a hyperinflationary era. These problems will continue to bedevil us. But if we continue to learn from one another and share information in a timely manner, we can mitigate those risks. So, Jen, again, thanks to you for all your leadership in this committee. And I would ask everybody to keep showing up in good faith. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Is there anyone else who has a question or comment before we, I think, probably good to transition into the next step. I'll do Eric, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say I echo all of that. I think it would be good to think of some more like readiness thresholds or milestones at the project year. I think we sort of have two problems in front of us. I think one is more guidance, being a little stricter for the future. And then the other one is kind of, what are we going to be doing over the course of this year preparing for the next tip development, where I think we're gonna see a lot of projects that are in fiscal years 26 and 27 get pushed out. And so what could we be doing over the course of the year to like prepare us for that? I think that's something we should have on the agenda for meetings, over the course of the year. And I do think we need, I don't know, we need to dig in a little bit about just kind of what are the sources of delay? And I want to make sure we're not hanging all the problem on the cities and towns. Because I have heard from many of them that have said, look, we've got all our things in, and we've been waiting on MassDOT, or MassDOT has taken over the project and they've added the project scope. So I feel like we need to also understand some of that dynamic.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate that. All right. Well, John, do you have something to add quickly before?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Eric's point. I mean, a couple things that we do at MassDOT, obviously, we've created a couple of new, I don't want to call them new levels, because I don't want to put people through more levels of project development. But because of the challenges that we've encountered over the years with scope creep and project costs, and MassDOT thinks one thing and the city or town and the consultants think something different. We've brought on a program management group that, I thought when I first came back to MassDOT, that was one of the areas where a project was initiated, it went through, and obviously I don't only deal with Boston on the MPO side, but we would get that difference of opinion that a community was thinking one thing and MassDOT was thinking something different. And so we took that project initiation and we turned it to our program team, because they were determining where the funding, what type of funding. Was it HSIP funding? Was it CMAQ funding? Was it STBG funding, et cetera? And asked them to, scope the project with the community, with the consultant. So we've offered that. We do that in-house with all of our own asset projects. We have offered that to cities and towns. Not everyone has taken us up on it, which is fine. We're saying, hey, we're just trying to, so that way, when we get to the finish line, we don't have the two different ideas. Obviously, we want to make sure that we're achieving some of the goals that were within our project development process, and the city or town wants to achieve the goals that they have when they first initiated the project. But when we go to the public with an outreach plan and we get that input, and sometimes it's not a bad thing to have a disagreement and a back and forth to come to, the best project we can get to. We try not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So we may not achieve all of the goals. We may not achieve all of the everyone's looking for, but at least let's get to here's the parameters, here's what we're following, here's the programming, the funding program that this fits within, et cetera. And and then MassDOT has to, work with the community to make it all happen. And sometimes, as I said, as people on this committee, as well as the full MPO, know that sometimes we don't see things all the same way, and we got to go back and forth, and there's revisions. And I know that that's in this slide deck, that the submission, the community thinks, oh, and the consultant sometimes thinks, hey, we made our submission, we're good. But it could take 6 months of back and forth revisions before we actually accept the submission and conduct a public hearing. And those are some of the nuances of project development. I don't want to delay, and MassDOT doesn't want to delay any projects for unforeseen things later on. But receiving a submission and then working through it with the community, working through it with the consultant, so we come to an understanding on a whole host of things, the cross section, the elevation, what we're going to include, sometimes an intersection within close proximity or ADA accessibility is just outside the project limits. And it would really make sense if we can incorporate it in the current project, which may increase the cost and push us out of constraint. And we try to work through that. But I think our program management team, it needs to mature a little bit. We need to, we continue to offer to the cities and towns when, a project is approved to recommend and help scope the project. So that way we can all come to an agreement that this is what it's going to include. It's just going to take a little time. And it's part of our maturing of that group and some growing pains that, we're going to have some differences and costs may increase and something might get delayed. But, our bigger picture is trying to achieve the best project that we can to meet the goals of both the community and MassDOT and the MPO. And I'll yield there. I just wanted to make sure that, we're trying, I'm not, I think, and I appreciate Brad's comments, I'm not trying to derail projects. I'm not trying to put projects out into the future outside the TIP program because I don't like something or, we need to work together to collaborate on what we can't fit within the project, what the cost can be, what the permitting can be. And I do this very often. Many on this call will know I offer that if you are stuck, if you are ever stuck, and with the potential of flooding my email and my phone, reach out to me. I'll find out where it's stuck, if it's in MassDOT's court, if it's in a permitting agency's, inbox, or if it's somewhere else. And I will do my best with my team to try and break that logjam so we can keep things going. So with that, I'll yield my time.
Appreciate that. Yeah, definitely. As Brad mentioned, appreciate MassDOT's collaboration in making process changes. I know that it's part of the challenge here is that there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot that goes into each one of these projects, and yeah, we want to work together to get something right that gets us more and more on the right track collectively. So thank you. With that, I do want to pass it back to Ethan to move to our kind of main agenda item of the day. That being said, I'll be reaching out, and feel free to reach out to me too to schedule some conversations kind of about where we move with these kind of expectations. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for the discussion there. We're going to have another discussion naturally after I complete these slides. We still have a fair ways to go. So before we get stuck into scenario 2 and the batch of scenarios that constitute it, I'll briefly recap what scenario 1A was, what was voted on last week. So primary action that scenario 1A took versus the Readiness Days presentations and recommendations made back in February was additional delays onto the rehabilitation of Essex Street and rehabilitation of Western Avenue in Lynn, shifting Essex Street to 2028 and Western Avenue to 2030. I should say in complementary action to some other discussions that took place around readiness, scenario 1A kept the Route 3A improvement project in Hingham and the Boylston Street improvement projects in Boston in federal fiscal year 26. It funded all community connections applications and 4 project design applications, and also funded phase 1 of the Linfield Rail Trail construction project in fiscal 26. Each of the 3 scenarios being presented here today reinforces that action. None of them differ from scenario 1A in regard to that. Now, with that said, if we go on to the next slide, this sort of takes us into what was left available after scenario 1A. So following the vote on that scenario, there's still about $26.4 million in fiscal 26 for any new uses or to keep in reserve for cost coverage. There's about $45.8 million of available funding in 2030 for any other additional uses that would be projected there. The scenarios being presented here today address that. Now, on the next slide, these 3 scenarios that I'm going to be getting into have a lot of things that are similar between them. For one, The cost changes that were mentioned at last week's MPO meeting, which were not initially factored into scenario 1A, are already captured here. This is for the Belmont Community Path project, which saw a 33.2% cost increase, and also a cost estimate that was provided by the City of Boston for the improvements on Boylston Street project, which was an increase of about 17.5% there. Now, these were captured in the most recent scenarios and were incorporated for reference here today. Yesterday, on the next slide, staff learned of a third cost increase that is not factored into these scenarios. So this is the intersection reconstruction at Route 3 and Bedford Road in Woburn and Burlington, which saw a 75% design submission on March 19th. Now, the project, it's worth noting, this is the same one that was recommended for delay out of federal fiscal year 25 into 26 as part of TIP Amendment 1, and also as part of the readiness scenarios. Last year, during development of the federal fiscal years 25-29 TIP, the project saw a 25% design submission in January, so its last submission was a little over a year ago, where it saw a 73% cost increase with that submission. Now with a 75% coming in March, the new total federal participating cost is 42% higher than that already increased figure from last year. So the project's budget is now at around $4.9 million versus the 3.5 it was sitting at, and where it was amended back onto the TIP, I should say, as part of Amendment 10. Now, staff learned about this yesterday and learned so through circulation of an agenda for an internal meeting that staff, or a regular meeting, I should say, that staff have with MassDOT weekly on various priority projects for near-term years of TIP programming. This is not going to be discussed further until next Tuesday. So staff are hoping to have that additional information as to what is driving this cost increase and any other potential readiness factors in time for the April 3rd MPO meeting. It is worth noting, each of the scenarios presented here today do leave sufficient funding in federal fiscal year 2030 to cover this cost increase. But getting the additional information to explain this is something we want to still continue to move ahead with. On the next slide, that takes us out of the cost increases. I'm actually going to sort of reiterate what Bill Danan from the City of Cambridge mentioned during the public comment stage of this meeting. So there's also been a change here. I was originally going to discuss that each of these scenarios currently includes the $2 million of funding for the separated bicycle lanes on Cambridge Street project that the City of Cambridge sought to advance during last week's March 20th MPO meeting. This was a project that was originally funded with a federal earmark that would expire at the end of this federal fiscal year, fiscal 25. And because of municipal right-of-way requirements for advancing this project, it was unlikely to be deliverable in fiscal 2025 due to some emerging complexities on the design. And so in the absence of the earmark, both MassDOT and City of Cambridge staff had recommended that it be considered for regional prioritization. Now, based on some discussions that are reprioritization indicated by the City of Cambridge to staff yesterday, on the next slide, the city is now requesting that $2 million in substitution of the Cambridge Street Bicycle Lanes project, which is already in the scenario, be instead allocated to design the Danahy Park Connector project. Now, my original intent with this slide was to say that in addition to the $2 million for the Cambridge Street Bicycle Lanes, that there be an additional $750,000 here for the Danahy Park pedestrian overpass. Bill, do you want to clarify something that I'm saying right now?
Sorry, Ethan. Yeah, just that there's, I think, a little bit of confusion with the names of projects. We have a current path project called the Danahy Connector project that you're, I think, mostly showing here. I'm not quite sure. So there's a path project that's ongoing, and the project I was talking about was the Fitchburg Crossing Bridge project. That's the RCN project that we're looking to get the funding for, not the Danahy Park Path project. They're both partly in Danahy Park, but I just want to make sure we have the name of it correct.
Yes, this is the Fitchburg Crossing project. Sorry, I'm a little bit too used to using shorthand on some of these projects. But yes, this would be to say that instead of having the current scenarios, they'll be presented later in this presentation, provide $2 million of funding to the Cambridge Street bicycle lanes. As they are currently doing, the City of Cambridge is instead requesting that $2 million be redirecting to support the design of the Fitchburg Crossing project. It is worth noting, as I will get to when we get deeper in the scenarios, that this was the highest scoring submission that the city provided for, or I should say the MPO staff received for construction applications this year. And that the city is looking to, for this funding to support a fairly uncertain situation around their partially obligated Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhoods Grant Award. On the next slide, we actually also have a new transit project that is incorporated in the scenarios, and I want to provide a bit of detail. Now, there's actually a few things here that are subject to change. I'll flag them when we get to them, but the cost is not one of them. This is a request from the MBTA for funding from the MPO for operational enhancements of bus routes 714 and 716, which is a request for $1.875 million in fiscal 26. Now, on the slide here, I refer to these as private fixed route services. These are contract services that the MBTA administers. So generally, folks may hear them referred to as contract services, others may say private. These are services that are contracted out by the MBTA to be operated, and as such, there's actually a unique opportunity here to utilize MPO funding to improve service frequencies in a way that traditional MBTA-operated bus routes are not able to be supported. The 714, for those who are not familiar, serves Hingham and Hull, where the proposed improvements here would deliver 30-minute headways for the corridor. In addition, the 716 bus serves Boston, Milton, and Canton, with headway improvements delivering headway improvements going to 45 minutes. I will also note other projects that are proposed for fiscal 26 not only potentially include bus stop upgrades for these corridors for capital investments as well, but it's also my understanding that MassDOT District 6 may have some projects on their line items that also improve stops for the 716 corridor. Now, I mentioned something was subject to change here, and I may have jumped the gun on this, so forgive me, folks from the MBTA, but in addition to the request for service frequencies on the 716, this also not only includes hourly Sunday service, but there's also the potential, which discussions are still ongoing, to my understanding, for a summer diversion on the 716 to Hodens Pond in the Blue Hills Reservation. This is consistent with a study that MPO staff did recently for improving access to the Blue Hills in the Boston region. Currently, the 716 bus goes to the Royal Street Commuter Office Park. Some folks on the board may be familiar with the Royal Street Commuter Office Park from a different MPO-funded bus service, shuttle service project from the past, but the proposal here is that on the weekends, when the office park isn't really being utilized, the bus instead crosses the intersection to the east and drops folks off at Hodens Pond instead. Also worth noting, besides this potential new connection, this would also establish additional connections for last mile connectivity in the commuter rail for Nantasket Junction, Canton Center, and Route 128. So this is a new project. This is something that staff received recently. It was not scored with the other transit projects this past fall, as it was a priority that emerged for the MBTA as part of their CIP development process and service planning process. On the next slide, this is one of 3 projects proposed for inclusion in fiscal 26 of new transit projects. This doesn't include all the new projects that were done for fiscal 25 with Amendment 10. So this includes the Better Bus Project operating safety improvements at bus stops. Excuse me. For the MBTA, that's at about $3.2 million. The next project is the Bus Priority and Accessibility Improvements Project, which is at $6 million. Very similar style of project to the Better Bus Project, where it would focus on bus stop improvements for accessibility and state of good repair region throughout the MBTA network. And then, of course, that operating enhancement project, where between these 3 line items, that's about $11.09 million of new transit projects in fiscal 26. So on the next slide, I'll just briefly summarize what's consistent between each of these scenarios. So again, all of these scenarios are building off scenario 1A, what was voted on last week. They currently all include $2 million for the Cambridge Street Bicycle Lanes project and the same new transit projects. It's worth noting, because they all include that $2 million for the Cambridge Street Bicycle Lanes project, they could be altered to change where that $2 million goes based on how board or committee or potentially board members next week feel on that. Also worth noting, because that's consistent, every scenario has the same federal fiscal year 2026 reserve. There's no scenario currently that is funding the Fitchburg Crossing project within the city of Cambridge, though there is sufficient funding to do so, especially if it's substituted for the Cambridge Street Bike Path. And there is also sufficient funding in reserve for each scenario to cover the cost increase at the Route 3 Cambridge Road and Bedford South Bedford Street project in Woburn and Burlington. I'll also note, because I didn't mention this here for the already, I should say, for the Fitchburg Crossing project. The distinction between the design request for the Fitchburg Crossing and other design pilot projects that are under consideration is that because there is already a contract in place for design services for this project, this is less a question of I should say, is more a question of funding for the project and not what was typically the case for the design pilot projects, where it's more a question of staff capacity at the MPO and MassDOT to ensure that the municipality adequately maneuvers through the design or contracting process for federal funding, which is to say the city of Cambridge has already done a lot of the work necessary to set up the design contract to enable this funding to flow into it. That is the primary hurdle that many of our design pilot projects have to go through. And so given that has already been satisfied, that's why it seems that there's a sort of exception being made in this case, because they already have that very significant milestone overcome. So with that, I'll then move into what is different about the scenarios, starting with scenario 2A. Now, again, there's going to be 3 scenarios here. Before I really get into the details, I'm going to mention scenario 2C is the most similar to scenario 1A. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's more just to say it's closest. Next week, staff may reorganize these scenarios just for easier consumption of information because there's a lot of things in here. So with 2A, new thing that staff are looking to present today is that scenario 2A is not only proposing the funding of 4 new projects in fiscal 2030, it also partially funds the Park and Pearl Street project in the city of Chelsea in federal fiscal year 2030. So, as some members may recall, during the Readiness Days exercise, there were various delays on projects, not the Park and Pearl Street project in Chelsea, but others within the city of Chelsea, that led to a large amount of work being present in the city, in addition to other local projects the city was advancing for utility work, for example. Due to traffic control and coordination concerns, the city then recommended that the projects be spaced out in the programming years of the TIP. Now, staff were not sure at that time if there would be sufficient funding in federal fiscal year 2030 to move the Park and Pearl Street project to 2030 as the city had initially wished. So during the Readiness Days presentations, the original assumption was that Park and Pearl would instead be removed from the TIP and would return next year in federal fiscal year 2031. Now, we do not have numbers for next year and federal fiscal year 2031. In order to provide a more secure position for this project and alleviate certain long-term funding obligations to other MPO target projects, this scenario proposes putting $8 of $13 million for the Park and Pearl Street project in fiscal 2030, with 4 projects that are smaller than others that MPO staff received applications for, each of which have recent cost estimates from this past fall, and near-term 25% design funding submissions for lower long-term risk. I'm not saying that there's no risk on these projects, as there will still be risks in 2031 and in these projects, but it is lower than certain other ones that were identified because of the relative scale, because of where their project design status is, etc. I'll also note there's a secondary objective here. I'm happy to get into this in the discussion phase, but for those who may review the executive summary of the TIP and also Appendix D of the TIP when it comes out, every year MPO staff conduct a regional funding distribution analysis on where regional target dollars flow throughout the Boston region. And for a few years now, in the Minuteman Advisory Group subregion in the Northwest, there's been a very low level of regional target funding there, less than 1%. The population of that subregion is about 5%. So generally speaking, this regional funding distribution analysis looks to attain close to parity between regional population and that funding distribution. Under scenario 2A, the magic subregion moves closer to 5% by hitting about 2.98%. of overall regional target funding. It's worth noting one of the projects that is in here will, with each year, because it is proposed for advanced construction funding, move that 3% closer to 5% over the next 2 TIP cycles. I'll also note, not just at the regional distribution scale, 3 of the municipalities of the 4 proposed here have not had a TIP project since fiscal 2016. And that TIP cycle at the earliest. So the secondary objective of 2A, besides some modest risk mitigation while still funding new projects, is trying to still meet that other objective of regional funding distribution. So on the next slide, I'll get into the detail of the 4 projects that are in here. The first is the Lebanon Street Improvement Project in the city of Melrose, which spans from Lynn Street to the Malden City line, with a funding allocation of $10.53 million. This project did have a 25% design submitted to MassDOT. I don't think project info has been updated yet on this line item, but it was submitted back in January. I will also note that the cost estimate that is displayed here is consistent with that 25% design submission. Project info is also, which is, for reference, the project information system is the system that MPO staff usually use to pull where our own cost updates and design status updates come from. I think that's showing a lower $4 million figure. So this line item is using the most recent cost estimate that we have available based on the 25 submission from the city of Melrose. This is mostly a roadway resurfacing project with the addition of a shared use path and sidewalks along Lebanon Street. For the 3 subsequent projects, these are projects that do not yet have 25% design submissions, but will have 25% design submissions either by the time the federal fiscal year 2026 to 30 TIP takes effect, which is October 1st, or before next year's TIP Readiness Days exercise. So on the next slide, to get into a little bit more detail on that, we have a project in the city of Newton, which also extends over into neighboring Needham, for a bridge replacement on Christina Street. This is a funding request for $5.55 million with a 25% design submission planned in fall of 2025. This is a bridge replacement for a deteriorating rail bridge over the Charles and also connects into the Department of Conservation and Recreation's broader Blue Heron Trail network. Moving on to the next slide, we actually have a project that staff were initially expecting a 25% design submission on for this month in March. This is the Assabet River Multi-Use Trail and Bridge Construction Project in Concord. Now, the funding request here is for about $9.1 million. The 25 was expected originally in March 2025, but with all the rain and snow we've had for the past few months, geotechnical boring on the riverbed for the Assabet River could not be accomplished due to elevated water levels. So the revised schedule that staff have received from the project proponent and the consultant, which I think we received about 3 or 4 days ago, now target around a fall 2025 date for the 25% design submission once the geotechnical analysis is resolved on the project. This project constructs a new pedestrian bridge running parallel, it's a separate structure, to the MBTA's Fitchburg commuter rail line over the Assabet River, connecting into not only a nearby office park, but also the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail near West Concord Station and some other planned areas of housing development. On the next slide, we then have a project that also appears in scenario 2C. So this project is included in 2 scenarios. This is the reconstruction of Hartwell Avenue and Bedford Street in the town of Lexington. The project cost here, which is a revised estimate from September 2024, is $46.2 million. This scenario programs $10 million of it, as given the scale of this project. It is also a project listed on the MPO's long-range plan. The project would likely be funded over multiple years using advanced construction. The time band for this project in the long-range plan is federal fiscal year 2029 to 2033. So the proposal here is to start funding it with $10 million in 2030, likely completing its funding in federal fiscal year 2032 should the schedule continue on its current pace. The 25% design submission based on the estimate provided by the consultant is around late summer 2025. This project focuses on construction of new sidewalks and shared use paths on both sides of the roadway for Hartwell Avenue and Bedford Street, connections to the Minuteman, and also providing additional connections into a very large amount of planned new housing developments along the corridor here, alongside other safety enhancements on the project. So with that, scenario 2A, again, funds 4 new projects and keeps Park and Pearl Street in federal fiscal year 2030 instead of deferring that cost to next year's TIP. This scenario has $4.11 million of remaining reserve in 2026. That is the same figure for each of the next two scenarios I'll be talking about. It does leave the most funding in federal fiscal year 2030 for other project uses at about $7 million. Now, 10 minutes before this meeting, I did receive a letter from the town of Marblehead. There is another project that the town of Marblehead is requesting be considered for fiscal 2030 to the tune of about $5.3 million. This is the Village Street Bridge project. It was scored by MPO staff. To be blunt, it did not score highly, but it can be funded using this remaining balance. I do not believe the town of Marblehead was able to attend this meeting as they're currently at a conference. I should say town staff are currently attending a conference, but I did want to know that there is an additional fifth project that, should this committee wish to recommend it, could also be included in 2030. 2A leaves the most funding overall of any of the years of the TIP, with about $16.5 million remaining between 2026 and 2030. Now, this is not to say it's the most financially, I should say, conservative for future TIPs. That's more this next scenario, which is 2B. If we can go on to that. Scenario 2B is fairly straightforward. It does not fund any new projects in federal fiscal year 2030. Instead, it fully funds Park and Pearl Street in fiscal 2030, and the Western Avenue project in Lynn, which has an advanced construction schedule of 3 years, is instead fully consolidated into federal fiscal year 2030 to the tune of about $47 million lump sum in 2030. It goes further than scenario 2A does in reducing the current cost obligations. When I say current cost obligations, I mean, what do we know today about what could be coming next year when we develop the 2027 to 31 TIP, though it does not necessarily address more of the cost risks that could be realized next year. So this reduces the immediate decisions that may be made that may impact long-term funding obligations to be satisfied in future TIPs, doesn't necessarily do risk mitigation on any specific projects. It is worth noting that by funding no new projects now, federal fiscal year 2031, so next year, will likely be able to fund more projects. However, by not funding new projects now, it's likely that many of the applicants that would be denied this year would likely reapply next year, leading to a much more competitive field, as not only could we expect that there would be reapplication from this group of applicants, we're also expecting that some of the 2025 design pilot applicants will start moving forward, in addition to other potential sources of project applications, including some project proponents that may have originally been pursuing or potentially utilizing federal discretionary grants, to say nothing of the readiness changes that may emerge next year. So this is to say, scenario 2B acts in a more conservative fashion given the information we know today. It may not necessarily pan out that way a year from now, but it does still try to hem in as much as the scenario can in the 5-year window. Scenario 2C, all right, before I jump to that, if we can go to the next slide, it's worth noting because Western Avenue is proposed for a lump sum funding in fiscal 2030, it does have very low reserves in fiscal 2030. Naturally, if there were to be a cost increase in fiscal 2030, for any project, that advanced construction schedule could again be reconsidered a future TIP. The reserves here in 2030 are just the result of choosing to put a lump sum on that project, not necessarily indicative of the reality of low reserves, which is to say. So now moving into scenario 2C, and I apologize for that pivot there. 2C is more of a traditional funding scenario, traditional in the sense that it mimics more of what was done in recent TIP cycles. It chooses to fund the 3 highest scoring projects of fiscal 2030 for fiscal 2030, but does not include funding for the Park and Pearl Street project as a result. It does defer the most risk to next year's TIP of the 3 scenarios, but it also continues to advance projects. And each of these 3 projects also has design resources committed from the project proponents to keep advancing design. Now, as with scenario 2A, these are projects that are not only well aligned with concentrations of new housing developments, but many of these also have large concentrations of existing housing as well. It's worth noting that in the case with any project that's doing a lot of development, though particularly in the inner core, Earlier delivery of these projects tends to mitigate the impacts that increasing land values may have on the expense of the right-of-way process or the complexity of the right-of-way process, or phasing with these new developments should they seek to do it utility impacts. So there is still an argument to be made with these projects that they should be delivered sooner, despite the fact that their designs may not be as far along as other projects that are proposed here. So with that, these three projects, and there's only two of them that are new here, are, on the next slide, please. So I will again note the Cambridge shared use path connection over the MBTA Fitchburg line at Danahy Park. This is a funding request for $18.24 million to construct this connection over the Fitchburg line. The project is still advancing towards the 25%, though it is not at 25% design right now. There is, of course, also that other request from the City of Cambridge to provide additional design funding to make sure that it can move towards 100% design and have the resources to do so. On the next slide, we also then have the Chelsea and Everett. The project proponent for this project is Everett. The reconstruction of Vine Street and 3rd Street from Chelsea Street to 2nd Street, which is a $13.1 million project based on a cost estimate from this past fall. The 25% design submission for this project, according to the city, is pending submission to MassDOT. I don't think it has been submitted yet. I'm not sure on that, but the city does say that they have a 25% design in the wings here. This largely focuses on new sidewalks and raised bicycle lanes in the city of Everett in an area that is planned for redevelopment, given proximity to the Silver Line and commuter rail. And the third project, as I've already mentioned here today, is the reconstruction of Hartwell Avenue and Bedford Street. It has the same advanced construction schedule plan as scenario 2A, $10 million in fiscal 2030, 25% design coming late summer 2025, and that is a cost estimate based on this past September. So with that, it takes us through the three scenarios. With 2030, there is a funding amount that is slightly less than scenario 2A in fiscal 2030, though not substantially. Now if we can go on to the next slide. Before we move into discussion, I just want to note something here, because this also came up in the meeting last week. None of the three scenarios that are presented here today are set in stone, and nor do any of these scenarios preclude the possibility of removing projects from the TIP for readiness issues, or requiring that any of the project cost increases on any of these projects, because the three I mentioned earlier are not the only ones that saw increases this year, be addressed by other funding sources. Modifications to this scenario, I mentioned earlier that the town of Marblehead was looking to be included in scenario 2A, could be discussed here, or the committee can opt to defer discussion of those adaptations or inclusions as part of their recommendation for April 3rd. That's the main focus of today's discussion. I do also just want to reiterate as well that if members have any questions on any of these projects, we can still adapt here. But when it comes to delaying projects further back, there's a reason I said removal. That does have a domino effect, which makes scenario adjustment messier. So staff are requesting that if a project is going to be selected today, that selection be targeted more towards removal, though staff can do some calculations offline to determine exactly what effect would a delay have on that project instead. Last thing I'll say before I kick it over to just a discussion on future meetings is that there were certain questions as to the 25% approval status that was raised at last week's meeting. I would want to note of the 30 projects on the TIP that currently have design statuses, only 10 of the 30 are actually at 25% approved or a later status. Almost all of those projects, in fact, I think all of those projects are in fiscal 26 and 27. So I will just note as well that 25% approved is a good metric. It is, however, for lack of a better phrase, a decimation of the program if that becomes a hard metric this year. So something to consider going forward, and definitely fertile ground for discussion over the coming months. On that note, on the note of discussion for the next slide, next meeting will be May 15th. That's meant to discuss updates between the draft and final TIP, and also to debrief on this TIP development process and start discussing policies and guidelines for project programming based on that motion from last week. We also may look to schedule a June meeting to maintain momentum on that discussion and reinforce those readiness policy and rescoring discussions. So with that, I'm happy to turn this over to discussion.
Ethan, yeah, let's give you a little bit of a break. That we powered through that. So yeah, let's transition into a discussion. Again, MPO staff are looking for us to express some preferences towards the scenarios. So if folks would be able to, both feel free to ask questions, but also to the degree that we can begin kind of sharing what we're thinking about the scenarios would be really helpful. So I'm not seeing any hands yet, but if members first have questions or thoughts. Len.
Well, and I guess I'm more so interested in discussing, what we do about projects that we know are going to go up in cost. We know that if we vote on any of these scenarios now, that there are going to be ramifications on years 2 and 3 out. Because when they get either to the 25% design, or approved, or even more so when they get to 75%, their costs are going to go up. So I think unless we do something really radical now, we are going to have to deal with questions and issues that Ethan raised towards the end sooner rather than later. It's just a matter of when we do that. And so I can see us getting out a tip now that's loaded up, and we just know we're going to have to deal with it, or we put out a tip that isn't loaded up. It has lots of capacity. With understanding that we're going to amend it, in order to put more projects in. I don't think we have the time, to develop a policy, that we can apply it equally to everyone, but maybe we do, but I don't think we do. And so I don't feel very strongly towards any of the scenarios, 2A, B, or C. That's why I'm not like saying do one of them. Whoever feels strongly about one of them, I'll go along with it. But I think in the end, let's continue the discussion that we are starting to have now, really soon, so that we can come up with some good policy with respect to how we handle projects that are not at 25%, and approved, yeah, that are not at 25% approved. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. Appreciate you stating your preferences, even if they were a lack of preferences, and absolutely heard on the continuing these conversations and keeping the momentum going. Brad.
Thanks, Jared. Great job, Ethan and staff. I did a bunch of homework to get ready for this meeting, and I still feel like I'm absorbing a whole bunch of new information. So I don't think I'm going to be able to offer my best thoughts in this moment, although I've taken a lot of notes and look forward to hearing what others are synthesizing. And I'm thinking that there's a couple of potential conflicting pressure points on us right now. One is that this MPO and this TIPR committee has talked for many months and even a couple of years about the importance of balancing commitments to legacy projects and creating a door open for new applicants, right? We want buy-in to this MPO. We want sub-regional equity. We want folks who haven't been on the TIP in a long time to be getting in the door and feeling optimistic that it's worth spending local dollars on design and on coalition building. So there's this tension with many of our big ticket projects that have had consistent cost overruns and schedule slips for many, many years. So that's just a tension we need to acknowledge here, right? I'm compartmentalizing the discussion here in two major ways. One is the FY26 surplus, which is a consequence of readiness issues. And in some ways, I think that's a little easier to unpack than the 2030 questions. And with 26, I think readiness has got to be the dominant factor. So we need to make sure the projects can be bid, can be permitted, can get in and out of a construction cycle and not have continued lag that then does the domino effect. I'm not going to recommend or pick favorites, but I think it's a whole bunch of awesome projects. And I appreciate everybody working to try to bring those to us. The 2030, I think I'll try to articulate one question and concern. I mentioned a minute ago how we as an MPO and we as a TIPper committee have done a bunch of process improvements, have created more moments of visibility, a better readiness framework in partnership with Mass DOT, and we've gotten a lot of great projects in the door as a result. And yet today we are hearing about other projects that are getting dropped on us today. And Ethan, I'm sorry you're hearing about some of them an hour ago or a day ago. I think there's a lot of good faith out there, and yet I am not feeling compelled to prioritize projects that just came in the door today for 2030, when we created many, many opportunities a month ago and 6 months ago for proponents to get in the same door. I would welcome those projects and those proponents as part of our continuing discussions, but that's just kind of one of the ways that I'm synthesizing all of this new information. So why don't I shut up for a second? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad. Gonna see if there's other members that want to speak first, and then after that we can go to Rich. Any other initial reactions? All right, Rich.
Thank you very much. And Brad, thank you for your comments just a second ago about new projects. I'm here today specifically about Western Ave and Lynn, and the Mayor's Chief of Staff, John Tebow, was on earlier. I happen to have the opportunity to meet with them, the Mayor, John Tebow, Principal Planner Aaron Clausen, to go over the results of last week's vote. And I have to say, they were disappointed. I heard Ethan just mention that the lion's share of projects in 26 and 27 have not achieved preliminary design phase submissions yet. And here we're ready to push Western Ave out to 2030. And I think the city was in agreement, as I mentioned in my remarks last time, that they were okay with pushing out Essex Street 2 years, but to push Western Ave out 5 years from now, I can assure you that the longer these projects sit around, they end up dying of their own fiscal weight, just because of inflation and everything else that goes with it. We currently have the submission schedule that's been sent to Mass DOT and approved for a July 7th, 25% submission and a design public hearing by the end of the year. Certainly the Western Ave project, and the city has assured its support in doing everything they have to do, particularly right away on a project of that size, would be able to make the 29 federal fiscal year. And so again, I'm appealing that decision with you folks just to reconsider. I think John had to jump off the line because him and the mayor had another meeting. But to push both projects out 2 years, when I'm listening to all of these other projects that are in some form of readiness, in the mayor's words, gee, that really wasn't fair to us. So anyway, I just want to put that out there. We do know that the Western Ave project would be spread over multiple federal fiscal years. I think, Ethan, you had mentioned that. In this case, it would be 29 and 30, or 29, 30, 31, if that's the case. But again, to push it out to FY30, the city has made a huge investment in advancing the design. They've reached several milestones. I mean, just getting through the ICE stage process, both 1 and 2, that's been approved. They're doing what they need to do to move the project forward. So I did want to just offer those remarks, and I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. Dennis.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Ethan, quick question. How long has the Lynn project been on the tip? When did they first submit
So
project to us?
the Essex Street project has been on the tip, I believe, for about 6 years. The Western Avenue project for about 3 years. Western Avenue was added as part of development of the federal fiscal year 2023 to 27 tip.
Okay. And they're not at 25 yet, after 3 years and 6 years.
They do not yet have a 25% design submission, at least from what I see on my end.
I mean, I think this is one of the issues that I have with projects that seem to take so long. Well, you know, I think we were liberal that period of putting them on the tip without having 25% designs. And I have issues with it just being around for so long and still not advancing. Although the city says they're critical, that they use all the words how important it is, but they still haven't advanced in any sort of significant way in 3 to 6 years. And so I'm getting frustrated with that. There's other projects, not just Lynn, but there's other projects that we've added to the tip over the years, and yet they have not progressed. So I'm somewhat reluctant to encourage folks to by keeping them there because of the inactivity of it. I don't recall what Lynn said to us last year. I thought the mayor came in and made an appeal to us to keep it where it was, and there were going to be some promises made that they were going to be making some advancements. I don't recall what they are or what those statements were, which leads me to another point, is that I think we need to have better documentation of timelines when people come in front of us and say this is what they're going to do over the next year or 2 years, that we have a document, because I can't remember what was said last year. But those are some of my concerns that we need to tighten up our schedule and our processes and make sure that commitments are made.
Thank you, Dennis. Yeah, and I think sort of kind of going back to some of the ideas for having expectations for information sharing. I think having consistent communication or around like projects needing to provide this information to MPO staff earlier in this process, so we're not kind of left to the last minute having to kind of hear perspectives that we can't necessarily have the information to verify very well. John, I'm calling on members first, so John and then Len.
Sure. I was just going to comment that when MassDOT conducted Readiness Days in early February, we assessed the 2 projects in Lynn and Essex Street. We recommended moving from fiscal 26 to 27. And that was because of a couple of items that needed to be that the city and the designer were working on to address, and we knew the submission was coming in because we get monthly schedules. And for Western Ave, we held fiscal 28 because we felt it aligns with an adjacent piece of Route 107, which is in that MassDOT is the proponent with the city of Salem, and a portion of Lynn, which connects to that Western Ave piece, and held fiscal 28 for that particular project in our programming scenario. And we can provide that information to the MPO. I can't do it for every single project in the time frame while we're talking about them, but I was able to look at my readiness sheets and our project info and make sure that there were no deal breakers, so to speak, on either of the 2 projects that said these got to go out much further than 1 year or 2 year respectively. So that's all I wanted to comment on, Jan. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that information. Len.
Thank you. So trying to be a good doobie here for Ethan. Having said I don't have a preference for a project, I'm trying to come up with a preference and a reason for that preference. And right now I'm going to go with A, because I feel that it leaves us a decent buffer. And I used barely decent buffer in year 2030. Essentially, I'm just looking for buffers so that we can absorb the cost increases that we know are going to come. And look, I appreciate Mr. De Benevento. He's very good. at advocating for its causes. And I know that every municipality is going to be disappointed. If their project doesn't go forward, at the fastest possible rate, and they will come in and make the case for why we should keep their projects where they are. But there are other projects that don't have people here advocating for them. And so we should keep that in mind. When we listen to people who come to talk with us about why we should keep their projects. I'm inclined to stick with the current set of projects as was voted on by the board. I'm in favor of doing more radical things, because I think no project should really go on the tip if it's not 25% approved. And if we as a MPO needs to help communities, municipalities design their projects, in order to get them to that 25% approved state, it would be money well spent, because I think it would help us keep control of the cost. Because as John said, we don't want to kick projects off because we don't like them. We need to manage, understand, be able to predict what we have to spend, and also create space for new projects that are playing by the rules. And I use that word loosely. Get on the tip, because my sense, and you can please correct me if I'm wrong on this, Ethan, is that we have raised the requirements for getting projects on the tip, and those that are coming on later, we're having fewer problems with. If that's wrong, then certainly we need to rectify that, because once again, we want projects that are at the 25% approved stage so that we can manage their costs. We help them manage their scope, whether that's caused by things that are completely out of their control or by MassDOT, so that when we get to the year 1 or 2 out, we know what they're going to cost with a high degree of probability, so that we can program the rest of the tip accordingly. So just circling back, I'll go with 2A. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. I appreciate that, and you moving us into a conversation around the scenarios before us. John, I believe you're next for members.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks, Ethan, for your presentation. Do you have like a slide or something that has a summary of the 3 different scenarios? I didn't write down notes, and I want to be able to provide feedback right now on which one I have a preference on. But if you don't, I don't know if you could cycle through very quickly, just because I want to give you the feedback you need.
Yeah, I can quickly go in order here. So scenario 2C, just starting with that one. It's the scenario that was voted on last week by board members, featuring all the 26 projects that we talked about earlier, and the 3 highest scoring projects that staff received scores for.
Okay.
Scenario 2B is the scenario that does not fund any new projects. It fully funds the Park and Pearl Street project in Chelsea, which was initially proposed to be removed, but would now return for just a more secure position. And it fully funds Western Avenue within this tip window to try to reduce long-term funding obligations to the project that would emerge in next year's tip. So no new projects, commits fully to Western Avenue, incorporates Chelsea Park and Pearl Street. 2A is sort of a blend, if you will, where it funds new projects like 2C, but those projects are smaller in scale, further along in design for the most part. And then, because there are some projects in, 2C, that are also further along, and leaves a little bit more funding in 2030. Of course, by funding new projects, it is still a risk. And to the question Len just raised, we do not really have enough data to know whether or not there has been adverse impact in recent years of the tip in adding those new projects. We only see cost changes when proponents provide design submissions. The absence of new information, the absence of new schedules on projects, does not necessarily mean that there is no risk on a project. We only move when we have the information to move. Also, sometimes the later years of the tip are lower risk because they're further away, so they are not as heavily scrutinized as projects in the earlier years of the tip. So I know you didn't ask that, Len asked that, but I also just wanted to kind of mention that as another factor as to why we could say 2C is the highest risk, 2B lower risk today, still fairly high risk in the future, and then 2A more of like a moderate risk.
Okay. No, that's very helpful. Thank you. I want to I'm gonna sift through these, and I saw that Adriana put some descriptions in the chat, so I'm gonna kind of think a little bit through quickly, and then I will provide comments. So that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, John. And I see Kristen.
Hi, thank you, and thank you, Ethan, too, for pulling this together. I think I'm leaning towards 2A, so for looking for some feedback. You know, when I look at this too, I'm looking for our region and trying to look at how the Magic region has been kind of under funded for a while, and I think this scenario is going to help us bring that closer up to that 5% mark to match with our, you know, our kind of our population levels. We have two projects that I know communities are really excited about and have funding fully committed and are moving forward. I've been in contact with Concord as well, and I think they're in a really good point, although, you know, they are at the stages that they're at. I have no concern at this point with them being able to make the targeted timelines. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. And I do want to thank Len, I think, for pointing out some feelings that I share. You know, I know this isn't necessarily for this conversation today, but I think that the design funds really do assist communities specifically that are smaller and have town meeting form of government, who I think tend to have a little bit more of a challenge trying to advocate for design funds without knowing that construction funding is programmed. And so, you know, I hear you on that, and I think that's it's a very real thing. So if we are able to, you know, assist communities with that moving forward, I think that makes a big difference.
Kristen, I appreciate that. And yeah, thank you for sharing your thoughts around the scenarios and also for the broader conversations. I'm gonna, Josh, I know you're not on the TIPper board, are an MPO member though, so I'm gonna go to you next.
Thank you, Jen. So I just want to comment here that I'm aware of some projects that have occasionally been delayed for lack of optimal coordination between different agencies. I mean, I can be, from my perspective, just coordinating between the municipality and the designer and MassDOT can sometimes be a challenge. And then when MBTA or DCR or other agencies get involved, that can be done. So we at the T are aware that there are times when whether it's permitting, access, approvals don't proceed as quickly as folks might like, or there could be legitimate reasons or disagreements. We're very committed to resolving log jams and bottlenecks and working with our partners, many on this call, many outside, just to make sure that when the MPO does have the opportunity to consider the merits of a project, there are not unknown or issues unknown to you that may delay them, because we do see that happen a lot. Sometimes there's really good reasons, but there's not always a good visibility for those reasons. So I think that is tangential to the discussion before you today, but I did want to assure you that we are aware and trying to work to resolve these things within our myriad departments, and we know that working with the T is not always straightforward. I figured that out after 14 months here, so I knew that before I got here. Anyway, thank you for the opportunity, and I apologize I've got to jump. Really healthy, great discussion. I appreciate everybody's engagement on this. So thank you all.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate those thoughts. And I think the distinction you drew between, these coordination challenges are going to continue to be coordination challenges. We can get better at them. We can try to incentivize them, build them into our processes. There's still going to, be points where we have to have understanding. At the same time, I think key, like the visibility you mentioned there, I think is part of how we need to have it, build these expectations for communication, so that this board is able to kind of make these decisions in a way that we feel good about. With that, Brad, over to you.
Thanks, Jen. A couple quick clarifying questions. Kristen, I appreciate your questions and your advocacy and your homework with your members in your sub-region. So I got a couple of questions about some of those projects on 2A for the staff, if that's okay, Jen. There was a Needham Newton project that specified a rail bridge. Ethan, and could you, or maybe even Josh, give us a little bit more detail? What is that rail bridge? Does it serve freight? Does it serve passenger? Is it on the MBTA's capital plan? That's one quick clarifying question.
I'm glad to, I don't know if anyone else knows about this, but I know this pretty well, so I could quickly explain. This is a bridge that was inherited by the MBTA many, many years ago. It was, active for freight. It's like goes off the Charles River branch, which is now the Upper Falls Greenway, and it's so it's planned for recreation use. It's the existing MBTA-owned bridge will be demolished, and working with DCR, who will ultimately own it. The city of Newton has earmarked to fund construction and design and working towards with the MBO for construction. I happen to know this because it was my project when I was in Newton a couple of years ago, but that's what that's all about. It really, the MBTA is only involved as a absentee landowner, I guess you could call it, because we have zero transit interest in that, but it's within our vast real estate portfolio. Let me know if you want any deals on abandoned real estate. I can.
Super helpful. Thank you, Chair.
Sure.
And then last question to clarify from staff in scenario 2A. I think my notes are a little thin. I think I saw that it had $4 million unprogrammed in 26, but I don't think I had the accurate note on how many on the funds unprogrammed in 2030. Can you clarify, please?
It's around $7 million in 2030, if I recall correctly.
Oh, my notes were correct. Awesome. Okay, that's all appreciated. I think I'll hold for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Brad. We'll go back to Rich, and then I would like to ask if anyone encourage folks before we conclude, if folks do have a motion to bring around a particular scenario, please, I welcome you to do that. We'll hear from Rich, and then Bill, and then okay, actually, sorry, John, a member has his hand up. So John, I'm going to go to you first, and then go to Rich and Bill.
I mean, thank you, Jen. I was going to just, make a motion. I know that we're ending up soon, but I know that Rich has been waiting a while, so we'll defer to you what you want. I'm happy to bring up my motion now, but happy to defer as well.
All right, well, let's hear Rich and Bill, and then John, welcome you to bring your motion immediately following that. We can please keep remarks brief so that we can get to the motion before we lose quorum.
Will do. Thank you. And thank you so much for indulging me. And I just wanted to say, I completely agree with Member Giambetti's comments about, we always hear these, the projects are ready and they don't go in, and I'm a familiar face at these meetings. And I've often heard folks coming in saying, oh, we can be ready. We can be ready. In some cases, the project hasn't even started, much less they're in the process of their 25% design. I think the issue with the city of Lynn and what their concern is that with all of these projects that are in some level of readiness, that both Lynn projects were delayed 2 years. They were willing to accept delaying Essex Street for 2 years. As a matter of fact, as I reported last week, the 25% design submission for Essex Street is due on March 28th. It is being submitted tomorrow morning. So the city is advancing their projects based on their schedule, right? And I see folks, shaking heads on that, but unless you're in the middle of these types of projects, and just what Josh was just talking about, working with the MBTA, these are high transit corridors too. There's been a lot of work going on. And once we get to this point, it allows these projects to move forward expeditiously because we've gone over the major hurdles of the project. Weston Ave has one of the highest scoring projects in the MPO at 74.9. It's a very worthwhile project. And to push it out 2 years, the city's fine with pushing it out 1 year to 29. But 30 is 5 years from now. And they just thought that was unfair. So I just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
Bill, last words before we go to John.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Just quickly, I just wanted to clarify. I know Ethan said all the scenarios had the Cambridge Street project in there. And I just wanted to clarify whether a motion had to like substitute in the Fitchburg Crossing project for the Cambridge Street crossing, given that it is a project in a very tight position. Their timing is not a question, given that we have our agreements ready. It's, you know, the money could certainly be obligated in the time needed. So I just wanted to clarify that.
I can speak to that. Yes, actually, thank you for asking that. In order to substitute the Cambridge bicycle lanes $2 million for the Dan Heath Park crossing, that would, or any action related to any projects here, it would have to be a motion that requests one of these scenarios with an amendment to take action X, whatever that action may be.
Thanks, Ethan. John, would you like to bring a motion?
Sure. I appreciate Adriana, you providing, and Ethan as well, summaries of the scenarios. And, based on what I've heard as well, I think I also have a preference for scenario 2A. I also like that, there's a lot of diversity in the projects and kind of provides a little bit more funding for like our magic subregion. I feel like a lot of projects tend to be centered around the greater Boston area. So I'm really happy to see that. So I make a motion to move forward with the Tipper Committee's preference for scenario 2A.
Thank you. All right. Any questions or discussions about that motion before we move to a vote?
Well, I was just going to second it. That's all.
Oh, yes, thank you. Sorry.
And I've said all I need to say or want to say. Yeah. Thank you.
Will you just put the 2A screen up?
I think that might have been a request. Yes, okay, there you go. Is this information you were looking for, Dennis?
I can also show the funding total slide and that kind of thing too. This is just the overview.
I'm also happy, just for the record, to just verbally reiterate what Adriana put in the chat. So just that scenario 2A programs new projects based on cost, readiness, and geographic distribution. This includes 4 new projects: the Melrose Lebanon Street Improvement Project, the Needham Newton Bridge Replacement on Christina Street Project, the Concord Aspet River Multi-Use Trail and Bridge Construction Project, the Lexington Roadway Reconstruction and Hartwell Avenue and Bedford Street Project, and the fact that this scenario also partially reprograms Chelsea's Park and Pearl Street Improvement Project in fiscal 2030 as well. Originally programmed in 2027, it was considered for delay to 2031 due to traffic coordination. The city of Chelsea has expressed that 2030 is also still suitable. And then Adriana has just put the fiscal constraint results on screen as well for reference.
Thank you, Ethan. Any further questions before we take the roll vote? All right. Seeing none, we'll move into the vote. So we have the motion to recommend scenario 2A to the full MPO board. I'll call first on MassDOT seat 1.
MassDOT seat 1, yes.
MassDOT seat 2.
Seat 2, no.
No. MAPC.
So I'm going to abstain because I'm still kind of researching all of these. I'm just not ready at this point, but it was a very good conversation. I appreciate it.
Sure. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Yes. Dickens, yes.
Town of Arlington.
John Alessi, yes.
Inner Core Committee, City of Somerville.
Brad Rawson, yes. And I will note that we have a lot of work to do still, team. So for Lynn, please keep advocating. Please advance your design. Staff and applicants, please continue to do the hard work so that the next conversations at full board or Tipper can continue to be informed. Thank you.
Brad. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
No.
I want to reserve my rights to say yes next week. I just not sure yet. I don't want to say yes and then vote no next week. I'd rather go no and then possibly yes. I just need to do more thinking and research on this, like sort of like what Eric. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton.
Mr. Gishard, yes.
Great. Metro West Regional Transit Authority.
Tyler Tarasi, yes.
Thank you. And Jen Rowe for City of Boston, I'll also vote yes. And John.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Just want to note that, I think I as well want to, look into these scenarios a little bit more, but based on the request from staff, want to just like get something out there about, what our preference is. I know that we'll probably have more time to think about these and have a good discussion with the full board next week. So just want to point that out.
Yes, thank you, John. And yeah, I'll also note that this vote was for a recommendation, an indication of a preference. The decision taken here today is not what will direct, it's not the final decision. So there is still room for folks to do more research, look into it, and come up with a different vote at the MPO meeting itself. Ethan, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, I did just want to note real quickly, because I did have a member ask me about this just now. For one, everything you just said accurate. That was part of what I was going to say. This is just a recommendation. This is going to be discussed further next week. So nothing is set in stone yet. But also just with regard to any amendments to this potential scenario, that could also be incorporated next week as well. So if there are any additional projects, changes to projects, worth noting 2A still includes that Cambridge Street Bicycle Lanes project as was just voted on. So that will likely need to be addressed next week, based on the motion as provided.
Ethan, John.
Thanks. I know we haven't heard the exact tally of the votes, but let's make sure that next week we let the full board know that this was, not all consensus here.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll make sure we get the full tally on that to report to the full board. Thank you. Is there anyone else who has anything to share or say before we kind of move? I think we actually have members items, so I guess on this topic. Seeing none, we'll move to members items. Dennis.
Thanks. Just a quick question. Is next Thursday's meeting in person still? Or do we know?
Yeah.
It is hybrid, yes.
Thanks.
And adding to that, I believe this one is in the boardroom. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Any other members items? All right. I'll then ask for if there's a motion to adjourn the meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Heard Len, and then seconded by Rad. All in favor? All right.
Yes.
We'll conclude this meeting. Thank you, everyone. I know this was a difficult conversation. I'm glad we're really grappling with very seriously with the challenges before us, and I hope to kind of continue this work with you all together to make these decisions hopefully easier, more informed, and continue to feel better about them as we go forward. So thank you all.
Yeah. Let's hope we don't get tarred and feathered next week. What did you all do? What were you thinking? So long. Bye-bye.